Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait for more audience to join us. Hope you are doing well today. Okay. All right. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I am Suliani Jeti from the Global and International Engagement Unit in the School of Education. This webinar is a part of School of Education, Global International Engagement and Career Connections summer webinar series that focus on students' career development. Our guest today, we're very fortunate to have Joanna, the Director of International Scholar Advising for IU's Office of International Services. We will learn about post-graduation non-immigrant work visa options with Joanna. We also have Andy and Emily from School of Education Career Connections here. They will share more resources with us. So before we start, I just want to say that this webinar will be recorded and the video will be uploaded to the GIE's YouTube channel. You can find it here. We'll also send a follow-up email and attach the presentation we used today and other links to the resources to all of you. And during this webinar, you can put your questions in the Q&A session. In the Q&A section, you can find in under the Zoom window here, and we will answer the question at the end of this webinar or during the presentation, right? So just put your question in there. Okay, so without further ado, I will first let Joanna to to do her presentation. And yeah, Joanna, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here this morning where we're going to talk about visa options available to students after graduation. The slideshow presentation, we will provide that to you after the session, so you'll be able to reference that as needed in the future. All right, we can go on to the next slide. The goals of the session is just to familiarize you with the U.S. visa system. There are lots of visa options available to remaining in the U.S., and we want to give you some resources to be aware of those visa options. Specifically, we want to talk about non-immigrant employment options that may be of use to you after you finish your degree and are looking for other options to remain in the U.S. And then also just to help you with your longer term career planning, thinking further down the road than just a year or two, but what might it look like to remain in the US longer term if that is one of your goals. Next slide. All right, we have a list here of a variety of non-immigrant visa options. Most of these options allow for some kind of employment activity in some cases. And so we're going to talk specifically about F1 and J1 student options, and then look more in detail at the H1B visa option, as those tend to be the most common options or the most preferred options. But we do also want to give you some resources that include some of these other visa options that could be possibilities if, for example, an H1B isn't a possibility. So we'll talk through these now. All right. There are, if you are an F1 student, so you're in the US pursuing a degree and you're in F1 visa status, there are practical training or employment options that are available to you specifically as a part of your student visa status. And those options are optional practical training and curricular practical training. Go on to the next slide. Curricular practical training is a work authorization option that is generally pre-degree completion. So it's employment that you undertake before your degree is complete. Curricular practical training is processed by OIS, so you would follow up with OIS and learn about the procedure to apply. And then OIS will process the request if you're eligible, and a new I-20 will be issued to you documenting the employment eligibility for specific dates at a specific employer. You do have to have a job offer when you apply for curricular practical training. And part of curricular practical training is that it's something that's integral to your curriculum. It's something that's needed for your degree. So for example, there are some degrees that require an internship to get the degree. And so if you need work authorization to complete that internship, then curricular practical training might be an option for you. There is no additional fee to apply for curricular practical training. And because it's part of the curriculum, you are required to be enrolled in a course that relates to the curricular practical training. So that's the first type, curricular practical training for students. The one that's more common would be optional practical training. If you are a student interested in optional practical training, you will want to contact OIS, and you will work through a checklist that's available in Atlas. And there are what we call full service or self-service options. You can actually meet with a student advisor, or you can work through the checklist and provide the information that's needed on your own. Optional practical training requires an application that is filed with the Immigration Service. Typically, it takes 3 to 4 months for the Immigration Service to process the request. And then a card, an employment authorization document, a card will be issued that you can then show to your employer to begin employment with the employer. To apply for optional practical training, you do not have to have a job offer. So that's a little bit different from the curricular practical training that I just mentioned. With optional practical training, you do not have to have a job offer at the time you apply. However, when you do find employment, it needs to be in your field of study. So this is somehow related to your degree that you are completed or that you have just completed. USCIS does require an application fee to apply for the optional practical training. And in general, students are eligible after there is a period of enrollment, generally for 2 semesters. And so this is where I will encourage you to look at the information on the OIS website, talk to an OIS student advisor, and take a look at the checklist in Atlas to see if and when you are eligible to apply for optional practical training. Optional practical training is typically valid for up to 12 months, and it's 12 months per higher degree. So if you're in the US and you complete a bachelor's degree, then you can apply for 1 year of OPT work authorization. If you go back to school to pursue a master's degree, you can apply for another 12 months of OPT work authorization. Let's say you complete a master's degree and then you decide to go back to, you've completed a master's degree and you've done your OPT, and then maybe you decide to go back and get your MBA, so another master's degree. You would not be eligible for another 12 months of OPT at the same level if you already took 12 months of OPT at the master's degree level. So again, 12 months per higher degree. And then for students who are completing a degree that is a STEM degree, if you are a STEM major, you may be eligible for an additional 24 months of work authorization under optional practical training. When you're working with an employer and thinking if optional practical training is an option, one benefit is that there is no salary requirement. And that will be important, particularly when we talk about the H-1B, that you don't have to worry about the salary that's being offered. There isn't a minimum salary that's required. There is a question about how many hours of CPT would allow you to be eligible for OPT. That is a great question, because after you use 12 months of full-time CPT, that can impact your eligibility for OPT. And so this is a case where it's going to be important that you speak with an international student advisor in OIS that can talk with you about your degree requirements, about the eligibility for CPT for your degree, and about how much CPT you should consider taking so that it doesn't impact your eligibility for OPT. And then again, there was a question, should we apply for OPT 3 to 4 months before we graduate? There are timelines that USCIS says you can only apply for OPT within certain windows. And I'm going to refer you to the OIS website where there's information on optional practical training and specific guidelines on when you should apply, depending on your degree completion date. All right, go on to the next slide. There are some limitations with OPT. Some of those limitations are listed here. One is that you can't begin employment until you have the OPT card, and you can only work during the validity dates listed on the card. So the OPT card will have a start date and an end date, and you can only work during those dates. So that can sometimes be a little tricky if you have an employer that wants you to start employment on July 1, but you don't have your OPT card from the Immigration Service yet. You won't be able to start employment until you have that card. That card is needed in order for the employer to complete the I-9 employment eligibility process. And so applying for OPT at the right time and allowing yourself 3 to 4 months for immigration to process the card is all part of the planning. And again, working with a student advisor in OIS, we can try to help you chart out what that plan and what that timeline looks like. Another limitation of F1 OPT is that it may be difficult to renew a visa abroad. And we say it may be difficult. It is not always difficult, but we want you to be aware of the possibility that it could be difficult to renew an F1 visa. So as you know, if you go outside of the US and you intend to come back, you need a valid F1 student visa stamp in your passport. It could be if you finish your degree and you have OPT work authorization and you decide to go home for the summer for a visit, and you need a new F1 visa stamp in your passport to re-enter the US, that the consular official may decide, no, we're not going to give you a new F1 student visa because you've already completed your degree program. If your employer wants you to come back and work, have your employer apply for an employment visa for you. That happens occasionally. It does not always happen. We have plenty of students who are on F1 OPT who travel outside of the US, get a new F1 student visa, and return to the US to continue employment. We just want you to be aware that it could be an obstacle that you need to consider. Another limitation is that while you're on OPT, there is a maximum of 90 days of unemployment. So OPT is an employment status. The Immigration Service gives you authorization to work, and the intent is that you are being employed in that status while you are in the US. And so you are required to report unemployment, and there is a maximum of 90 days. And going over that 90-day limit could impact your F1 status. Full-time employment is available on OPT more than 20 hours a week. Multiple jobs are an option. So maybe you work for 2 different employers for 20 hours a week. That's okay. Volunteer work is also a possibility while you're on OPT. And the big factor with OPT is the employment needs to be related to your major field of study. So the Immigration Service is authorizing employment that is connected to the degree that you just obtained. So if you have gotten an education-related major, a degree in an education-related field, the Immigration Service wants you to be able to show how the employment you're undertaking is directly related to your major. And then while you are on OPT, you are required to continue reporting the information that's listed here, any name or address change, any change in your immigration status. As I mentioned, you need to report unemployment. And then if there are any changes in the employment while you're on OPT, that also has to be reported. So all of this information is just kind of a step back, a broad overview of OPT, what you're eligible for and what some of the limitations are of OPT. And again, OIS has full resources on our website. We have resources that you can use, having an appointment with an international student advisor to talk about your specific situation, your specific degree, the timelines of when you need to apply for OPT. So take advantage of those resources if you want to pursue OPT. I'm going to stop for just a second. It looks like we have a few questions that have come in. One of the questions, do you only apply for OPT right before completing your degree? Again, there are specific timelines of when you can apply for OPT. You apply for OPT generally close to your degree completion date. So there will be a specific window of time where you are eligible to apply for your OPT. And yes, that is before your degree is completed. And the employment needs to start within a window after your degree is completed. And again, specific window and date timelines are available on the website. And the reason why I'm not getting more specific with that is because there are differences depending on what your situation is. If you are a PhD student, for example, we're looking at when do you submit your dissertation, when do you defend, when is the degree conferred. So I'm being really general in those timelines, but the question regarding do you apply for OPT before completing your degree, that would be yes. All right. If I want to teach at a university beginning in August of 2024, when should I start my OPT application? Again, same scenario that I just answered. It will depend on when your completion date is. And so an OIS advisor can help you decide the timeline of when you should submit your application. You can use OPT is for post-completion OPT. So after your degree is complete, OPT is for more than 20 hours. So yes, you can work multiple jobs that add up to more than 40 hours. If you are doing that, you are going to want to be sure that you follow the guidance on the OIS website and within Atlas, where you are reporting all of your employment information that's required in SEVIS. If I'm a junior and I want to have an internship for the summer, do I apply for CPT or OPT? That also is a great question. CPT, again, is employment that is integral to your program. So not all majors, for example, require an internship. So maybe your major doesn't require an internship, but is there a course within your degree field that requires some kind of work experience? And if so, that might be a situation where you would be eligible for CPT. If you're not eligible for CPT, there are some options for applying for what's called pre-completion OPT. And again, a student advisor will be able to help you figure out if your work opportunity is something that would fall into CPT or if it's something that needs to be considered for OPT. Any changes of name or address need to be done within Atlas. You can do that in Atlas, and OIS will update both your SEVIS immigration record and your IU record with that information. All right, let's move on to J1 academic training. And we'll just talk about J1 academic training briefly. I would anticipate that most of the students on this call are probably F1 students, but if we do have J1 students, there is something called academic training. It's very similar to the F1 optional practical training. Some advantages: academic training is authorized by the program sponsor. So if you hold a J1 DS 2019 that Indiana University processed for your program, then Indiana University would authorize your academic training if you are eligible. That is done in the Office of International Services. It's not an application that needs to be sent to the Immigration Service like the OPT is. So an advantage is that generally applying for academic training would be faster than the F1 OPT. If you are on a J1 DS 2019 that was processed by a program sponsor, not IU. So maybe you're a Fulbright scholar, or maybe you're an IIE scholar. You would need to confirm with your program sponsor to see if you are eligible for academic training. You'll see a limitation in that some sponsors don't authorize academic training. So depending on who your program sponsor is, you may or may not be eligible for J1 academic training. J1 academic training is generally for up to 18 months of employment in your field. If you are a PhD candidate, there may be an additional 36 months that would be eligible, that you would be eligible for after degree completion. Academic training can be part-time or full-time, and again, there are no salary issues that we need to consider with academic training. A limitation of academic training is that you must have a job offer in your field in order for the academic training to be authorized. So unlike F1 OPT that you apply often before you have a job, with academic training, you have to have a job offer in order to be authorized for the employment. And the same sorts of limitations regarding renewal of visa abroad. There could be difficulties with getting a new J1 student visa to come back to the US to work. Not always an issue, but we want you to know of the possibility. All right, next slide talks about J2 spouses. If you are a J2 spouse, or if you have a J2 spouse, J2 spouses can apply for work authorization. There is not a specific employer. You don't have to have an employer letter to apply for work authorization. It can be full-time or part-time. And this is an application that is submitted to the Immigration Service for work authorization. So there's a fee that's required. And again, it generally takes the Immigration Service 2 to 3 months to process the work authorization. In general, a J2 spouse can work for 1 year at a time, and you reapply every year. But occasionally the Immigration Service will approve longer periods of time. And this is included, this slide in particular, because we often have spouses that are completing degrees in the US. And so either you or your spouse may be, for example, offered employment at an institution as a J1 research scholar or professor that we'll talk about in a minute. And if so, if one of you is a J1, it is often a benefit that the J2 can apply for work authorization. And the next slide is about J1 research scholars and professors. We include this in one aspect because we know we have graduating educators who may be applying for teaching positions at institutions that are not tenure track positions, but are teaching positions or research positions. The J1 research scholar or professor visa category is a visa category that is valid for up to 5 years. So it could allow you up to 5 years of research or teaching employment authorization. The J1 research scholar or professor visa category can be for full-time or part-time employment. And that can be of a benefit if you are not able to find full-time employment. Again, as I mentioned, if you are a J1 researcher, a J2 spouse can apply for work authorization. And this visa category can be paid or unpaid. So maybe you have an employer that wants to pay you, or maybe you find an unpaid research position, for example, where you are going to self-support. The J1 research scholar may be an option, and there are no salary issues. Some limitations, though, of this is that the J1 is not for a tenure track position. So if you are completing a PhD and you are looking for an assistant professor or tenure track position, the J1 would not be an option. However, if you find a lecturer position, for example, it might be a non-tenure track lecturer position, the J1 research scholar professor visa category might work. The J1 visa classification may come with a 2-year home residence requirement, meaning at the end of your J1 program, you may be required to return to the US, or excuse me, to return to your home country to take the skills that you've learned back to your home country. This J1 research scholar professor category is not a student category. It is a research or a teaching professor. It is an employment or research category. And you may be subject to a 12 or 24-month bar. What this means is the J1 visa classification is a non-immigrant classification. It's meant to be short-term. After you complete a program, you may be required, or excuse me, you may be subject to a 12 or 24-month bar that doesn't allow you to continue to stay in the US long-term in J1 research scholar or professor category. There was a question, is it possible to transfer from F1 to J1 post-graduation? And the answer to that would be yes. You will want to check with your employer to see if they have a J1 program. Employers have to, institutions and employers have to apply to the Department of State to have a J program. So typically, employers such as institutions of higher education, those will be the places where you will find J1 research scholar professor opportunities. Typically, this would not be a visa category if you are looking for a position within industry. All right, next slide. We also want to talk about the TN, Treaty NAFTA or Canada. If there are any students on the call that are from Canada or Mexico, there is a specific visa category, the TN visa category, that might be one that you are eligible for. The TN is for a specific list of professions, and there are education-related professions on that list. The employer will provide you with an employer letter documenting what the employment is, the terms of the employment, the dates, the salary, and then you either, if you're Canadian, you provide that letter at the port of entry and enter the US, or if you are Mexican, you would take that documentation to the consulate to apply for a TN visa to enter the US. TN is a visa that we see occasionally. So just keep in mind that if you're Canadian or Mexican, that might be a visa classification that you are eligible for. There's also a classification on the next slide, the E3. This is a visa classification similar to the H-1B, which is where we will spend most of our time. The E3 is a visa classification specifically for Australians. So we will talk about in just a moment that there are a certain limited number of H-1B visas granted each year. And so if you are a graduate and you are from Australia, just keep in mind that if those H-1B numbers are all used up, that you might have the opportunity to find employment based on the E3 visa category. And then the next category we'll talk about is the O1. This is a visa classification for extraordinary ability in science, art, education, business, or athletics. It is a very paper-intense petition, sometimes 200 to 500 pages of evidence, documenting how the person is at the very top in their field and known internationally for specific contributions that they've made to the field. I can tell you at IU, we have filed several O1 petitions over the years that I've been here for incoming researchers in the School of Education. They've had specific backgrounds in a very targeted area of education, and we were able to document how they were on the leading edge of their research in the field. So the O1 visa might be an option that you would consider if you are at the level that you are contributing to your field such that you're known internationally. The O1 petition is one that your employer or your attorney would file for you. All right. There are a couple of questions about the H-1B, and that's where we're going to start now. Our focus is going to be on the H-1B. A lot of students who are F1 or J1 students, they will complete their degree and they will start their employment path in the US based on their OPT work authorization or their academic training work authorization, maybe for a year. And then after that period of time, the employer might, if they are eligible, apply for an H-1B visa. Some advantages of the H-1B. The H-1B allows for dual intent. What this means is you can have the intent to either return to your home country or to remain in the US for the long term. When I mentioned applying for a new F1 student visa while on OPT, the F1 visa is not a dual intent visa. So when the immigration officer gives you that F1 visa, they want to, there's the expectation that you will come back to your home country at some point. That is not the case with the H-1B visa. So this visa is especially advantageous if you have the intent to remain in the US long term. In most cases, the H-1B is for a 6-year maximum. The employer can apply for H-1B status up to 3 years at a time for a maximum of 6 years. There are some cases where a person can be in H-1B status beyond 6 years, and that's typically if the person is also in the process of applying for permanent residence. But in general, it's important for you to know that this would allow initially a 6-year maximum of work status in the US. The H-1B is employer specific. So if you work for one employer, that employer files an H-1B, and that H-1B petition is for employment with that employer only. If you have secondary employment, or if you move to a new employer, the new employer must file an H-1B petition before you can work for that employer. So multiple employers can file, but the employment is specific to the employer who has filed for you. Another advantage is that the H-1B can be premium processed, so your employer can pay an additional fee, and the application can be processed in 15 business days by the Immigration Service, as opposed to 3 to 4 months regular processing. There is also something called portability. You can move from one employer to the next employer, provided the next employer has filed an H-1B petition for you, allowing you to port your H-1B status to the new employer. Another advantage, and it's kind of an advantage and a limitation, H-4 spouses cannot usually work, but in limited situations, if you are also applying for permanent resident status, depending on where you are in the permanent residence process, while you're in H-1B, your spouse might be able to apply for work authorization. The limitations listed here, there is an H-1B cap for industry. So if you are going to be working in industry, we will talk in just a few minutes about some of the limitations. There are limited numbers of H-1Bs available. I talked about the petition being employer specific. Also, another limitation is that the H-1B is called a specialty occupation visa. So it is for a position that requires a bachelor's degree in a specific field at a minimum. So even though you might have a master's degree or you might have a PhD, if the position does not require a bachelor's degree in a specific field at a minimum, then the position is not eligible for the H-1B visa classification. The H-1B visa also requires a minimum salary requirement. So the employer must pay at or above the wage that is set by Department of Labor. Again, this is different than like the OPT that we talked about in the beginning. You can find a position on your OPT and you don't have to worry if the employer is paying a salary that meets the Department of Labor requirements. And another limitation is that if you have been in the US in J-1 status previously, you may not be eligible for an H-1B visa if you are subject to the 2-year home residence requirement. There are fees associated with the H-1B visa. These are fees typically paid by the employer. There are different fees depending on if you are working for an employer who is in industry or an employer who's in higher education, for example. And so just keep in mind that because there are fees associated with the H-1B, sometimes your employer might not want to pursue the H-1B because of the fees associated with that. These are fees that must be paid by the employer. In general, these fees cannot be paid by the employee. And the next slide is about the H-1B cap. So if you are completing a degree and you will be looking for an employer who is in industry, it is important to know that that employer will likely be subject to what's called the H-1B cap. There are 65,000 H-1B slots available per year, with an additional 20,000 set aside for applicants that have a master's degree or higher. So we're looking at a pool of 85,000 H-1Bs per year. Those numbers, especially, when it's a situation where we're in a good economy, those numbers are taken up very quickly. And so if you're looking at an employer in industry and you want to talk about the H-1B, it will be important to consider and to be aware of the fact that there are a limited number. It is a lottery system. Your employer files an application for you. And if you are one of the 85,000 selected, then immigration will process the H-1B request. The H-1B cap year starts October 1 of every year, and your employer can file an H-1B application 6 months prior. So your employer can file an application April 1 for a position that starts H-1B status starting October 1. And keep in mind that, as I mentioned, the cap is often met within the first few weeks or months of that April 1 date being opened. So we'll talk about some scenarios in a minute, what to do if you're caught in this H-1B cap situation. And then just one other note is that there are set-asides for Chile and Singapore. So if you are an applicant from Chile or Singapore, you might not have to worry about this cap because there are set-aside numbers for you. And your employer may or may not be aware of that. So if you are from one of these countries, be aware that there may be some additional options for you if the H-1B cap is met. There are some exemptions from the H-1B cap. For example, institutions of higher ed or some nonprofit research organizations and government agencies may be exempt from the cap. So, for example, if you are completing your PhD and you are applying for teaching positions at institutions around the US, those institutions of higher ed are likely exempt from the cap. That means those employers can file an H-1B petition for you at any time once an offer of employment is made. You don't have to worry about getting an application filed by April 1 in hopes that it would be approved for an October 1 start date. Other exemptions, if you were counted against the cap previously, so maybe you started with an industry employer and you move to new employment with a new industry employer, you've already been counted for your first application. You're not subject to that lottery system again. And then H-1B extension or amendment petitions. If you're working for an employer and you finished your first 3 years and your employer is filing an H-1B extension for your next 3 years, you are not subject to that cap again. All right, the next slide is about the Immigration Bridge Program. So this is a program specific to IU. It's a partnership between various IU career centers, OIS, and the specific attorney's office to assist IU students with H-1B needs. For example, perhaps you find employment with an employer. Maybe it's a small employer and they have never filed an H-1B application. They don't know how to even start the process. This bridge program allows you as the student to submit an e-form in Atlas. You provide us with the information about the employer, and OIS will then contact the Human Resource Office with the employer, with the immigration counsel from this immigration firm, and at a reduced rate, a significantly reduced rate, I will add, the immigration office will file an application working with your employer so that the employer doesn't have to figure out how to file an H-1B application, but it can be done through the immigration bridge process. This is important for you to remember if you, like I said, are looking for employment and find specifically a small employer who doesn't know how to go about the process. you can have this as a resource, and your employer might be willing to consider moving forward with an H-1B with the assistance of the firm. Okay. And I mentioned the cap gap. So what happens, this is a scenario where we see sometimes students, F1 students in particular, can have the potential for a gap in employment. And what do we do? So perhaps you've applied for OPT and your OPT is granted, but the expiration date is prior to October 1. So remember that October 1 date that we're working with is if you have an employer who's in industry and your employer submits an H-1B application on April 1 for your position to start, the government's fiscal year starts October 1. So that's the target date that we're looking at. So your H-1B start date is October 1, but your OPT expires before. What are your options so that you don't have a status issue and so that you might be able to continue your employment? Some possible options to think through. Are you a STEM major? Would you be eligible to apply for a STEM extension that would allow you to continue to work between your OPT expiration date and your H-1B start date of October 1? Occasionally, the government will offer cap gap extensions, meaning they will offer that you can remain with your employer, you can remain in status while you're waiting for your H-1B to start. Maybe you take this time to travel outside of the US, go home for a visit, see your family, come back October 1 when your employment starts. Another option is, can you look for a cap exempt employer? So maybe you can find an employer that isn't subject to the cap and that could go ahead and submit an H-1B petition for you and you wouldn't have to worry about it. And then there are some options where people apply for a change of status to another visa status to bridge that gap. The cap gap issue can be a concern for our students. And so this would be another example of where we want you to be in contact with an international student advisor in our office so that we can specifically take a look at your specific case and help you decide what you might need to do or what your options are so that we don't have an issue with your status in between your OPT ending and your H-1B starting. Okay, got a couple of questions I'm looking at here. If an O-1 is filed by an attorney, is a job offer required? Yes, the O-1 is an employment application, so a job offer is needed with the O-1 application. An exception to that, kind of an exception, is the O-1 is also a visa type that musicians and entertainers use. And so maybe an O-1 doesn't have employment with a specific employer. Maybe they're coming to the US to do concerts for a year. And so that would be an exception where it would be a little bit different. But generally, I think for the people who are on this webinar, the O-1 will require a work authorization letter or an offer of employment. Does an O-1 visa make your visa type multiple entry? If you apply for an O-1 visa at a US consulate abroad, depending on your country, yes, the O-1 is typically a multiple entry visa. There may be some exceptions depending on country, but in general, yes. Let's see. Is an H-1B visa risky, and do you have a high chance of getting rejected? So I think what is important to consider is, are you graduating with a degree that requires you to be applying for employment with an employer who is in industry, so not exempt from those cap numbers. And if that's the case, it is a lottery system. There are, as we mentioned, 85,000 spots for H-1Bs. So it is a little bit risky. What we often talk to students about is figuring out a plan for maximizing your status in the US. So go ahead and apply for your OPT work authorization. You can start employment with the employer based on your OPT. And then if your employer files an H-1B and it's approved, then you can move into H-1B status. Don't think that you have to graduate and immediately find an H-1B visa. Keep in mind that you have that OPT, and if you're a STEM major, you have that STEM OPT as options to help maximize your employment status time in the US. The 6-year H-1B maximum is not specific to one employer. So it is 6-year maximum overall. So maybe you start 1 year with one employer, you move to another employer for 3 years. Now you've used 4 years of your H-1B status and you have 2 additional years left. The cost of using a lawyer to file an O-1 petition, that will just vary by attorney. I would expect probably a minimum of $2,000 to $3,000, but again, that's just a guess on my part. How many times can you apply for H-1B status? You can apply as many times as you have an employer who is filing a legitimate petition for you for the H-1B status. Is it possible to start out with OPT and after that apply for O-1? Yes. As I mentioned, use your OPT if you're eligible for it, and that can help you maximize your options in the US. And we'll move on to the next slide. And I think that one of the takeaways that I hope that you get from this session is that you can work in the US without a green card. So some people think, I don't have a green card, or I'm not a permanent resident, I can't work in the US. Or some employers might think, you don't have a green card, you're not a citizen, we can't hire you. What you can say to employers, you need to know what your options are so that you can advocate for yourself and inform your employer about what your options are. Again, optional practical training, you probably have 12 months and you may have an additional 24 months if you're a STEM major. If you're a J1 and you're on academic training, you have a period probably of 18 to 36 months, depending on your degree program. The H-1B may be an option. If you're looking specifically at institutions of higher ed and you're specifically teaching or research, you might be eligible for the J1, and you might also be eligible for the O-1, or there may be some of those other visa categories. Maybe you're from Canada, Mexico, Australia, so there are options available for you. And we want you to know your options so that you can advocate for yourself and let your employer know what's available. And then we also have a resource list for you on the next slide. Optional practical training and academic training. These are links to the OIS website where you will find very detailed information about what optional practical training and academic training are, as well as application processes for each. Network with your alumni. People who have done this before, they will have good advice for you about what to do and what not to do. And then obviously you will want to use the resources that the School of Education has provided to you. And I think that my colleagues here are going to share some other information about School of Education resources.
Yes, thank you, Joanna, for your presentation. Now we will quickly have Andy and Emily talk about more resources from Career Connections.
Yes, thank you so much. I think I have the ability to share my screen here. My name is Andy Bosk, and I'm the Director of Career Connections, which is the Career Services Office for the School of Education. So I wanted to just briefly share our website. Career Connections, this is our homepage, and you can see our upcoming events, some of which you might be interested in, such as today, visa options after graduation. So keep an eye on our event feed here, but you might be most interested in the Find a Job page. And so if you've ever done any job searching yet here at IU, you may already be familiar with Handshake. This is the career services management platform that all of us, at least undergraduate offices of career services, use on campus, and some graduate offices as well. But if you click on that, get into Handshake and go to the job board, it is very robust. I think right now, as it loads, there are somewhere upwards of like 17,000 jobs posted, and you can use filters to navigate and get down to exactly what you'll be interested in. And so if you see the feed over on the left, that's just them trying to show you what they think is most relevant to you based on your Handshake profile information that you've entered. But if you go to all filters, you can narrow it down by the type of job or experience you're looking for, and specifically job roles, industry, if there's a certain employer you're looking for. Work authorization is a good way to filter those, and there should be geographic region is where, oh, that's over here in the location filter. So I definitely want to suggest you check out Handshake if you've never have before. That's also a way that School of Ed students can make an appointment with one of us career coaches. If you want to do that, you can just head over to Career Center, and might take a while to load again, but ultimately you can go here to appointments. And again, if you're a School of Ed student, make sure you choose School of Ed Career Connections. If you're from another school, you could choose your other school's career office instead. So this is Handshake in a brief nutshell. I also wanted to refer to our Career Connections job search guide, which probably should have, oh, there we go. It's already loaded. So there's like 30 to 40 pages of job search suggestions, tips, information in here concerning interviewing, resumes, and lots of resources as well. So it does mention Handshake right off the bat, and some of these are more teaching specific, since the majority of the population we serve is looking to go into teaching. Then some more general resources. Indeed, LinkedIn has their own job board these days. Idealist.org, GuideStar, or search some education tangential sites where you can find great opportunities. And then if you're thinking about, if you want to keep your options open and you're looking at other countries to work in, there are lots of good resources here as well. And I wanted to make sure Emily had a chance to talk about a brand new resource that we are going to have soon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily McCord. I am the Associate Director of Career Connections. And I just wanted to share with you I'm very excited about this. The IU Bloomington campus has decided to adopt a job search resource called InterStride, and it's a platform that's designed specifically for folks who are seeking employment outside of the country in which they are a citizen. And so while certainly you can use it to find employment in the United States, it also allows you to search for job opportunities throughout the world. A couple of things that are really special about this particular resource that will be unveiled in about a month or so, and there'll be some targeted sessions for teaching students how to use it. You can filter different job categories specifically by the visas that they typically sponsor. You can also look at analytics for different institutions and companies, and it'll tell you how many visas they have sponsored in the past. So you can get a feeling for whether a place sponsors a lot of visas or just a few. And there are also really cool country insights where you can get a sense for cost of living, different things you would want to know about a place where you might be thinking about being employed. And there's also a networking section where you could interact with other folks who have been through the same process that you're hoping to navigate and might be able to give you some valuable information. So again, that's called InterStride, and it's going to be available to students on IU's campus very soon, and we'll make sure you know about it. It'll be announced, and there'll be training sessions so you can learn how to use it. We're all very excited about it in Career Services. And that said, I would also say, just please use OIS when you have questions. I noticed a lot of very specific questions in the Q&A, and just know that resource is available to you, and it's an amazing resource. Take advantage of it because that's how you're going to get information that's specific to your situation and will be most helpful to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily. We actually have several questions in the Q&A box, and I would say that we can take 2 more minutes and let Joanna quickly answer some of the questions. And yeah, Joanna, would you please?
So there's a question about OPT applying before you graduate. And I would just again refer you to the OIS website for information on the application period, as well as talking to an advisor in our office. Depending on the specifics of your academic program, we will be able to give you more solid guideline as to when you should actually apply. But typically, yes, you're applying for OPT before you graduate. There's a question about, does the 90-day period begin on the start date listed on the OPT card? I'm guessing that is 90 days of unemployment. I think that's probably what the question is. And my answer to that is, I think so. I do not process or applications for OPT. That is done by the student advising staff. So I think that the 90 days starts when the OPT period begins, but I would, whoever has asked that question, I would encourage you to look to confirm on the OIS website or confirm that with an advisor to make sure of that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. As we said in the beginning, this webinar is recorded, and you can find our recordings on our YouTube channel, IUSOEGIE, and we'll also send a follow-up email to all of you with the resources that we just mentioned in this webinar and the recording links. So thank you again for attending this webinar, and also thank you so much, Joanna, Andy, and Emily, for making this webinar happen. Like, we're looking forward to our next webinar that focuses on student employment. Thank you, and see you. Have a great day. Bye.